Kevin Marshall Morrison, you have been found guilty of 3 counts of capital murder. For your unspeakable crimes against your own family, this court sentences you to death by lethal injection. You will be remanded to the custody of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice immediately. This is a farce. You'll all regret this. I'm innocent, and the truth will come out. On September 3, 2022, in an upscale neighborhood of Dallas, Texas, Kevin Morrison strangled his wife, Rebecca, in their garage while she loaded groceries from their SUV. He then drowned their 9-year-old daughter, Madison, in the family pool and suffocated their 4-year-old son, Tyler, in his own bedroom before meticulously cleaning the crime scenes and calling 911 to report them missing. 3 weeks earlier, he'd forged Rebecca's signature on documents naming him sole beneficiary of her $900,000 trust fund. Just 5 days before the murders, Rebecca had discovered evidence of his gambling addiction. Over $200,000 in secret debt that threatened to destroy the life he'd built. Rather than face exposure and financial ruin, Kevin chose to eliminate the only witnesses to his lies and spend the next 10 days organizing search parties, giving interviews to local news stations, and posting desperate pleas on social media, all while knowing his family's bodies were hidden in a storage unit he'd rented under a false name just 2 miles from their home. The first call came in to Dallas police at 11:23 p.m. on September 3, 2022. The dispatcher heard the anxious voice of 34-year-old Kevin Morrison reporting that his wife and 2 children had vanished without explanation. His words came in rushed bursts that sounded like barely controlled panic. He explained he'd been at his accounting firm until late, working on quarterly reports, and returned home around 11 to find the house dark, Rebecca's car in the driveway with the driver's door still open, grocery bags spilled across the garage floor, but no sign of his 9-year-old daughter Madison, his 4-year-old son Tyler, or his wife. The dispatcher, a 12-year veteran named Patricia Holmes, noticed something unusual in Morrison's vocal patterns. His breathing seemed too controlled, his descriptions too detailed, as though he'd rehearsed this conversation. She kept him talking, asking about the grocery bags, the positioning of Rebecca's car, the specific items scattered in the garage, buying crucial minutes for responding units already racing toward the Morrison residence in the affluent Lakewood neighborhood. Before we dive deeper into this tragic case, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support helps bring awareness to these important stories. Now, let's continue with what happened that night in Dallas. Officers Daniel Reeves and Sarah Kim arrived at the Morrison home at 11:38 p.m., their cruiser's lights illuminating the manicured lawn and pristine 2-story colonial that screamed upper-middle-class success. They found Kevin pacing in the circular driveway, running his hands through his hair in what looked like distress. But when he approached them, both officers would later note in their reports that despite the warm September night, his dress shirt showed no sweat stains and his hands were remarkably steady for someone claiming to be in crisis.
The house appeared exactly as Kevin described. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, everything in its place except for the concerning scene in the garage. Rebecca's silver Lexus SUV sat with its driver's door ajar, interior lights still on, draining the battery. Reusable grocery bags had spilled across the concrete floor, their contents scattered. A gallon of milk, boxes of cereal, fresh produce, all suggesting an interrupted routine. But Officer Kim noticed something peculiar. The items were arranged almost too carefully, spread in a pattern that looked staged rather than dropped in haste. Kevin led the officers inside, his narrative flowing with precise detail as he pointed out Rebecca's purse on the kitchen island, Madison's backpack by the stairs, Tyler's favorite stuffed dinosaur on the living room couch. Every item seemed to tell a story of normal family life suddenly disrupted. Officer Reeves began documenting the scene, while Kim questioned Kevin about the evening's timeline, her training making her alert to inconsistencies. Kevin stated he'd left for work at his usual time, around 7:30 that morning. His firm had been preparing for an important client presentation, so he'd stayed late, not unusual for tax season. He claimed he'd texted Rebecca around 6 p.m. to let her know he'd be working past dinner, and she'd responded with an understanding message. He'd finally left the office around 10:30, stopped for gas, and arrived home to find the disturbing scene in the garage. His timeline sounded plausible, his demeanor appropriately worried, but Kim noticed he kept touching his wedding ring, twisting it around his finger in a repetitive gesture that suggested anxiety rather than grief. When Kim asked if Rebecca had mentioned any plans to go anywhere that evening, Kevin's response came fractionally too fast. "No, absolutely not. She always tells me everything. We don't keep secrets. She'd never take the kids anywhere without letting me know." The emphasis on communication and transparency struck Kim as overcompensation, the kind of statement guilty people make when they're trying too hard to appear trustworthy. Officer Reeves completed his initial sweep of the second floor and returned with troubling observations. Madison's room showed signs she'd been preparing for bed, pajamas laid out on her carefully made bed, her homework neatly stacked on her desk. Tyler's room was similarly orderly, almost unnaturally so for a 4-year-old space. The master bedroom revealed more concerning details. Rebecca's laptop sat open on the nightstand, the screen dark but still warm to the touch. Her jewelry box stood open, but nothing appeared to be missing. In the master bathroom, Reeves found Rebecca's medication bottles in the cabinet, including her daily vitamins and a prescription for anxiety she'd apparently been taking. When Reeves asked if Rebecca had been struggling with anxiety or depression, the man's expression flickered with something hard to read: irritation, defensiveness. "She's been fine," he said curtly. "Maybe a little stressed about Madison's school stuff, but nothing serious. She wouldn't just leave. Someone must have taken them." The pivot from defending his wife's mental state to suggesting abduction happened so smoothly it seemed practiced. As midnight approached and more officers arrived to canvass the neighborhood, Kevin's performance began showing small cracks that the first responders documented with growing concern. He resisted calling Rebecca's parents initially, saying they were elderly and he didn't want to alarm them until there was something concrete to report. When finally persuaded, he made the call with clinical detachment, delivering the news like he was reporting a delayed flight rather than his family's disappearance. He volunteered that Rebecca had been emotional lately, that perhaps the stress of managing the household while he worked such long hours had become too much. He suggested maybe she'd needed a break, maybe she'd driven somewhere to clear her head. Each comment subtly implied Rebecca might be responsible for the situation while positioning himself as the rational, concerned spouse. When asked about recent arguments or tensions, Kevin admitted they had normal marital disagreements, but characterized them as minor, never mentioning the financial secrets that would soon come to light. Detective Linda Martinez arrived at the Morrison residence at 1:47 a.m., called in because missing children cases in Dallas always warranted immediate detective involvement, and something about this particular situation had raised red flags with the patrol officers. Martinez, a 20-year veteran with a particular skill in interviewing deceptive suspects, observed Kevin for a full minute before introducing herself. His body language was all wrong, too still in some moments, too animated in others, never settling into the genuine distress that real victims displayed. Martinez shook Kevin's hand and noted its coolness, despite the September humidity and his supposed emotional turmoil. She began her interview with the same questions the officers had asked, watching Kevin's eyes for the micro-expressions that betrayed deception, listening for the subtle changes in his story that indicated rehearsal rather than genuine recall of events. Kevin repeated his timeline with remarkable consistency. Left for work at 7:30, busy day at the office, late presentation prep, home around 11:15. But Martinez noticed he provided abundant detail about some aspects while remaining vague about others. He could describe exactly what Rebecca had texted him at 6 p.m., but couldn't remember which colleague he'd been working with during his supposed late-night session at the office. When Martinez asked him to name the client for whom they were preparing the presentation, Kevin hesitated before providing a name that Martinez would later discover didn't match his firm's client list for that period. Martinez then shifted to questions about Rebecca's habits, her relationships, her daily schedule with the children. Kevin's answers painted a picture of a controlling husband who monitored his wife's every activity, who expected detailed accounting of her time, who couldn't conceive of her making decisions without his input. He described Rebecca's daily routine down to the minute: when she did school drop-off, when she grocery shopped, when she prepared dinner. The level of surveillance he'd maintained suggested a man who needed absolute control. The interview continued in the kitchen, Martinez sitting across from Kevin at the granite island, observing every gesture, every micro-expression, every tell that 2 decades of experience had taught her to recognize. When asked about finances, Kevin's face twitched almost imperceptibly. He acknowledged they were comfortable, that Rebecca had a trust fund from her late grandmother, but claimed he didn't involve himself much in those financial matters. Martinez noted he was lying. His eyes shifted left, his hand went to his collar, classic deception indicators. When asked about life insurance policies, Kevin provided numbers with surprising quickness: $500,000 on Rebecca, $250,000 on each child. Standard amounts he said their financial advisor had recommended. He didn't mention that he had attempted to increase Rebecca's coverage 3 times in the past year, each request denied by the insurance company due to insufficient justification. Martinez made a mental note to subpoena all financial records immediately. When asked to describe his relationship with Rebecca, Kevin's narrative painted himself as a devoted husband and father, a provider who worked hard to give his family everything they needed. But Martinez noticed he spoke about Rebecca with detachment, describing her qualities like he was reading a resume rather than discussing someone he loved. He mentioned her organizational skills, her efficiency, her ability to manage the household, but never spoke about her laugh, her dreams, the intimate details that genuine partners knew and cherished. As dawn broke over Dallas on September 4, 2022, the police department mobilized a comprehensive missing persons response. Patrol units checked area hospitals, parks, shopping centers, and highway rest stops. Detectives reached out to Rebecca's friends, family, and former colleagues. K-9 units prepared to search the surrounding neighborhoods at first light. Kevin appeared to welcome this activity, maintaining his role as desperate husband and father. But Martinez noticed he never asked the questions a truly terrified spouse would ask. He didn't demand updates every few minutes, didn't press officers about expanding the search, didn't break down sobbing at the thought of his children in danger. Instead, he watched the police activity with measured interest, occasionally checking his phone, adjusting his responses based on the reactions he observed. Martinez had seen this before: guilty parties trying to act innocent, following what they imagined was the correct script, without understanding that genuine emotion doesn't follow scripts. It flows unpredictably, overwhelms rational thought, produces responses that can't be manufactured through performance alone. The morning of September 4, 2022 brought intense heat to Dallas, temperatures climbing toward 90 degrees before 9 a.m. The Morrison neighborhood transformed into a command center, with police vehicles, news vans, and volunteers gathering to search for Rebecca, Madison, and Tyler. Martinez had spent what remained of the night reviewing initial reports and coordinating with various departments. And something kept troubling her: Kevin's insistence about his whereabouts, his absolute certainty about his timeline, felt less like truth and more like a prepared alibi. Martinez knew that in cases like these, time was critical, but she also knew that the person responsible often inserted themselves into the investigation, directing searches away from evidence while appearing helpful. She assembled her team in an unmarked van down the street, assigning tasks with urgency, while privately suspecting this had already transitioned from rescue to recovery mission. The neighborhood canvass began systematically, officers going door to door, asking if anyone had seen Rebecca or the children, if anyone had noticed anything unusual the previous day. Most neighbors expressed shock and concern, describing the Morrisons as a model family, though several mentioned they'd heard arguments from the house in recent months, raised voices late at night, doors slamming, the sounds of conflict that neighbors pretended not to hear. One neighbor, an attorney named James Chen, who lived 3 houses down, mentioned something that caught Martinez's attention. He'd seen Kevin's black Mercedes leaving the neighborhood around 3:30 p.m. the previous afternoon, which contradicted Kevin's claim of being at his office all day. Chen couldn't be certain of the exact time, but remembered because he'd been leaving for an early dinner reservation and had noticed Kevin's distinctive car with its...
But the real breakthrough came from the house directly behind the Morrisons, where a family named the Patels had recently installed a comprehensive home security system. When Martinez knocked on their door at 9:23 a.m., Priya Patel answered with obvious concern, already aware of the situation from the police presence. Martinez asked if their security cameras captured any view of the Morrison property, and Priya immediately called her husband, Raj, who managed the system. The Patel's camera system was sophisticated, with multiple units covering their property from various angles. One camera, positioned to monitor their backyard and pool area, captured a partial but crucial view of the Morrison driveway and side yard. Raj pulled up the footage on his laptop, and what appeared on the screen made Martinez's instincts flare. There, in high-definition clarity, was Kevin Morrison's Mercedes pulling into his driveway at exactly 3:18 p.m. on September 3rd, over 8 hours before he claimed to have arrived home. Martinez watched the footage with laser focus. Kevin emerged from his car at 3:19 p.m., looked around the neighborhood with obvious caution, then entered his house through the side door. For the next 47 minutes, there was no visible activity. Then, at 4:06 p.m., the camera captured Kevin carrying what appeared to be a large rolled carpet or tarp to his car, struggling with its weight. He loaded it into his trunk with visible effort, his movements deliberate and methodical, then returned to the house. At 4:31 p.m., Kevin emerged again, this time carrying 2 large black duffel bags, one in each hand. He placed these in the back seat of his Mercedes, again checking the street nervously before climbing into the driver's seat. The car reversed out of the driveway at 4:35 p.m. and disappeared from the camera's view, heading toward the main road out of the neighborhood. "Can you send me this footage immediately?" Martinez asked, her voice tight with controlled urgency. Raj nodded, already downloading the files to a USB drive. Priya stood nearby, her hand over her mouth, realizing they'd captured something significant. Martinez thanked them, instructed them to preserve all original footage and discuss what they'd seen with no one, especially not Kevin Morrison, then radioed for backup to secure the Patel residence as a critical witness location. The timestamp 4:35 p.m. became pivotal to the case, because Kevin had stated repeatedly, with absolute certainty, that he'd been at his office until after 10 p.m., that he couldn't imagine what had happened to his family. Now Martinez had video evidence proving that claim was a lie. He'd been home during the afternoon, and he'd loaded something large and heavy into his vehicle. The rolled tarp or carpet particularly troubled Martinez. Its shape and the way Kevin struggled with it suggested it contained something substantial. Back at the command post, Martinez immediately dispatched officers to Kevin's accounting firm to verify his alibi for September 3rd. She personally began the process of obtaining search warrants for the Morrison home, Kevin's Mercedes, his cell phone records, and any storage units or properties registered to him. The Patel footage constituted probable cause, but Martinez wanted an airtight case before revealing what she knew. Within 90 minutes, detectives returned from Morrison & Associates accounting with information that shattered Kevin's timeline completely. While he had arrived at work at his usual time around 7:30 a.m. and attended a morning staff meeting, his supervisor confirmed that Kevin had left the office at 2:45 p.m., claiming he felt ill and would finish work from home. Kevin had sent several emails from his phone between 6 and 9 p.m., creating a digital trail that suggested he was working, but the security footage proved he'd been home since 3:18 p.m. The timeline became clear. Kevin had left work claiming illness, returned home when he knew Rebecca would be there with the children, then loaded something large into his car along with 2 heavy duffel bags. His digital activity later that evening, the emails, the texts, had been carefully crafted to establish an alibi, while his family was already dead or dying. Martinez knew she needed to find where Kevin had gone after leaving at 4:35 p.m., needed to track his movements through Dallas, needed to discover what he'd done with those items he'd loaded so carefully into his Mercedes. Detective Martinez understood she needed to maintain the investigation's appearance as a missing persons case while privately treating it as a homicide, a delicate balance requiring her to keep Kevin close without alerting him to the evidence mounting against him. She returned to the Morrison home where Kevin was surrounded by Rebecca's family who had arrived overnight, her parents, Margaret and Robert Chen, maintaining a vigil in the living room along with Rebecca's younger brother, Andrew. Martinez pulled Kevin aside for what she framed as a routine follow-up conversation, asking him to walk through September 3rd one more time, curious whether he'd correct his lie or dig himself deeper. Kevin stuck to his story with remarkable consistency, worked all day at the office, never came home until 11:15 p.m., found the house empty and the garage scene disturbing. Each repetition of the false timeline added another layer to his deception.
"Did anyone at your office see you during the afternoon?" Martinez asked casually, as if merely clarifying details for her report. Kevin nodded confidently, listing colleagues he'd supposedly interacted with, apparently unaware that detectives had already interviewed those same people and found his afternoon presence utterly unverified. One coworker had even mentioned Kevin seemed distracted and anxious during the morning meeting, like he had something heavy on his mind. Martinez thanked him, expressed continued hope for the family's safe return, and left Kevin with the impression that he remained a concerned husband rather than the prime suspect. Outside, she briefed her team on the strategy, maintain the search effort publicly, but focus investigative resources on Kevin's movements on September 3rd, his financial records, his personal life, and most critically, finding what was in that rolled carpet and those duffel bags and where he'd taken them. The search warrant for the Morrison home was approved by Judge Thomas Wilson at 4:70 p.m. on September 4th, allowing crime scene investigators to conduct a thorough examination under the guise of looking for clues to the family's disappearance. Kevin was asked to stay with Rebecca's family at a nearby hotel, a request he agreed to with feigned cooperation while the CSI team descended on his house with luminol, alternate light sources, and grim certainty they'd find evidence of violence. The master bedroom became a focal point when luminol revealed blood traces on the carpet near Rebecca's side of the bed, despite obvious cleaning attempts. The pattern suggested cleanup rather than accidental spillage. The ensuite bathroom showed more concerning evidence: diluted blood in the sink drain, cleaning product residue in the tub, and a faint bloody footprint on the tile that matched Kevin's shoe size. Madison's room appeared undisturbed on the surface, but forensic examination revealed chlorine traces on her bedding that seemed inconsistent with normal household exposure. Tyler's room showed similar chemical traces, along with fibers that didn't match any carpeting in the house. The garage yielded crucial evidence. The scattered groceries that seemed so staged were exactly that. Forensic analysis showed the milk had been poured deliberately, the produce arranged rather than dropped, all of it designed to create a scene that suggested interrupted activity. Kevin's Mercedes, examined under warrant at his office parking lot, revealed traces of blood in the trunk that preliminary tests indicated belonged to multiple individuals. The carpet fibers found in the trunk didn't match any carpeting in the Morrison home, suggesting Kevin had used something else to transport bodies. Most damning was a child's hair clip, Madison's favorite butterfly clip that Rebecca's mother would later identify, found wedged in the back seat where the duffel bags had been placed. Cell tower data obtained through emergency warrants showed Kevin's phone pinging towers in a pattern leading southeast from his neighborhood toward an industrial area near the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex boundary. The towers placed him near a cluster of self-storage facilities off Highway 80, large commercial operations with hundreds of units. Martinez immediately deployed teams to those locations, knowing every hour increased the possibility of evidence degradation or discovery by civilians. As officers prepared to canvass storage facilities, Martinez couldn't shake the image from the Patel footage. Kevin's careful movements, his nervous surveillance of the neighborhood, his methodical loading of that carpet in those bags. The man in that video knew exactly what he was doing, and that cold calculation made Martinez fear the worst for the three missing victims, whose faces now appeared on every news broadcast in Texas. The media coverage of the Morrison case intensified on September 5, 2022, with local news stations running continuous updates and national cable networks beginning to pick up the story. "Affluent Dallas family vanishes without trace" became the headline, accompanied by photos of Rebecca's warm smile, Madison's gap-toothed grin from her latest school picture, and Tyler's cherubic face. The public saw a desperate search for an innocent family, volunteers searching parks and waterways, police following leads, a devastated husband pleading for help. Kevin Morrison made his first public appeal on the morning of September 6th, standing before a cluster of microphones outside Dallas Police Headquarters. He wore a polo shirt that looked deliberately rumpled, his face showing calculated stubble, his eyes carrying manufactured exhaustion. "Rebecca, if you can hear this, please come home," he said, his voice catching with practiced emotion. "Madison, Tyler, Daddy needs you to be brave. We're looking for you. Please, anyone who knows anything, help us bring them home." The performance hit every expected note: the loving husband, the devoted father, the man destroyed by inexplicable tragedy. News anchors praised his composure under stress. Social media campaigns spread with hashtags like "Find the Morrison" and "Bring them home." Donations poured into a fund Kevin had established supposedly to aid search efforts and offer rewards for information leading to his family's safe return.
Detective Martinez watched the press conference from the police station, studying Kevin's micro-expressions with trained scrutiny. His tears glistened, but never fell.
His body language showed none of the physical collapse genuine grief produces. His shoulders remained square, his posture controlled, his gestures purposeful. When a reporter asked if he had any theories about what happened, Kevin's response came too smoothly. "I just can't understand it. Rebecca's been under stress lately, maybe overwhelmed with the kids. I pray she's somewhere safe, just needing space. I just want my family back." The subtle implication that Rebecca might be responsible, that she might have left voluntarily, that she might be mentally unstable, each suggestion was calculated to shape public perception while deflecting suspicion from himself. Behind the scenes, Martinez's investigation was systematically dismantling every lie Kevin had constructed. One of the most significant breaks came from Rebecca's best friend, Jennifer Walsh, who came forward on September 6th with information that completely changed the narrative Kevin had been building. Jennifer told detectives that Rebecca had discovered Kevin's gambling problem just days before she disappeared. Over $200,000 in secret debt, losses at casinos and illegal poker games that threatened to destroy their finances, and Rebecca's children's trust funds. Jennifer provided text messages where Rebecca described her shock and betrayal, her plans to secure her trust fund assets and potentially divorce Kevin, and her fear of his reaction when she confronted him. "He didn't yell or get angry," one text read, dated August 30th. "He just went completely cold, started asking about my trust fund paperwork, where I kept the documents. It scared me more than if he'd screamed." Another text from September 1st stated, "I told him I was taking the kids to my parents this weekend to think things through. He said I wasn't taking his children anywhere. Jen, I'm actually afraid." That weekend never came. The text messages painted a picture of a controlling husband facing exposure, a man who saw his carefully constructed life crumbling and chose murder over consequences. But there was more. Jennifer revealed that Kevin had been forging Rebecca's signature on financial documents, attempting to gain access to her trust fund to cover his gambling debts. Rebecca had discovered this just days before her death and had contacted an attorney about protecting her assets and filing for divorce. The financial motive became clearer as investigators dug deeper. On August 12, 2022, Kevin had filed paperwork with what appeared to be Rebecca's signature, naming himself as primary beneficiary of her $900,000 trust fund in the event of her death. The trust administrator, contacted under subpoena, confirmed the signature looked authentic, but expressed surprise since Rebecca had previously designated Madison and Tyler as primary beneficiaries with her parents as trustees. Handwriting analysis would later prove Kevin had forged his wife's signature, adding document fraud to his growing list of crimes. The forgery had been completed just 3 weeks before Rebecca's murder, demonstrating clear premeditation. Kevin had also attempted to add himself to Rebecca's parents' life insurance policy on her, a request that Margaret Chen had denied, finding it inappropriate. On September 7, 2022, the investigation reached a crucial breakthrough when a storage facility manager on Highway 80 called the police tip line. He'd seen the news coverage and remembered renting a climate-controlled unit to a man matching Kevin's description on September 3rd. The man had paid cash for 3 months, used what the manager later realized was probably a fake ID with the name David Chen, and had specifically requested a unit in the back of the facility away from security cameras. He seemed nervous, the manager told Detective Martinez, kept checking his watch, asking about privacy policies, wanted to know if we monitored the units, said he was storing valuable items from a relative's estate and needed maximum security. Paid the full 3 months up front in cash, $890. That stuck with me because most people pay by card. Martinez obtained an emergency warrant and assembled a team to search the unit. On September 7th at 4:23 p.m., bolt cutters removed the lock from Unit 247 at Store Safe Dallas, and what they found inside would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The climate-controlled unit was small, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, and the smell hit them immediately, even though the air conditioning had kept decomposition slower than it might have been. Inside, arranged with disturbing care, were 3 bodies. Rebecca Morrison lay wrapped in an expensive Persian rug that Martinez would later learn had been taken from the Morrisons' living room. A rug worth over $15,000 that Kevin had apparently sacrificed to conceal his wife's body. The rug had been secured with duct tape, and Rebecca's body showed signs of manual strangulation, her neck bruised, her eyes showing petechial hemorrhaging consistent with asphyxiation. The 2 duffel bags the Patel camera had captured sat beside the rug. Inside the first, investigators found 9-year-old Madison Morrison, her small body showing signs of drowning, water still present in her lungs, chlorine traces on her skin and hair consistent with pool water. The autopsy would later reveal that she'd been held underwater in the family pool, struggling for nearly 2 minutes before succumbing. Her arms showed defensive bruises where someone had gripped her tightly. The second duffel bag contained 4-year-old Tyler, who had been suffocated. Forensic analysis would show fibers from his own pillow in his nose and mouth, indicating Kevin had smothered his son in his bed, pressing the pillow over his face for the 4 to 5 minutes it took for the child to stop breathing. The horror of these deaths, the intimacy of them, the time they took, the consciousness required to maintain lethal pressure or force made even seasoned investigators need to step away from the scene. The storage unit yielded additional evidence: the cleaning supplies Kevin had used to scrub blood from his home and Rebecca's laptop and phone, which he'd hidden rather than destroyed, and a handwritten note in Kevin's distinctive handwriting that read simply, "No other way. They'd ruin everything. Better this than poverty and humiliation." That note, more than anything, revealed Kevin's mindset. His family's lives mattered less than his pride and financial status. Detective Martinez stood in that storage unit as the bodies were carefully documented and prepared for transport to the medical examiner, and she felt a cold rage that transcended professional detachment. Kevin Morrison had murdered his entire family to avoid facing consequences for his own choices, had killed his children rather than let them live with their mother after divorce, had shown such callous disregard for human life that he'd treated their bodies like inconvenient luggage to be stored and forgotten. The arrest warrant was signed by Judge Wilson at 7:12 p.m. September 7, 2022. Charging Kevin Morrison with 3 counts of capital murder with special circumstances. Martinez personally led the arrest team to the hotel where Kevin was staying with Rebecca's family, having maintained his performance of the worried husband, even as detectives found his victims. When Martinez knocked on Kevin's hotel room door at 7:51 p.m., he answered wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, his face arranged in an expression of hopeful anticipation, as if expecting news about the search. "Kevin Morrison, you're under arrest for the murders of Rebecca Morrison, Madison Morrison, and Tyler Morrison." The expression that crossed Kevin's face wasn't shock or denial, it was calculation, his mind visibly racing to construct a new story, a new performance. But Martinez had no patience for it. She read him his Miranda rights as officers handcuffed him, and Kevin's only question as they led him away was, "Who told you about the storage unit?" Even in arrest, his primary concern was identifying which part of his plan had failed, not the lives he'd destroyed. News of Kevin's arrest spread across Dallas within hours, the media narrative shifting from missing family to family annihilation, from mystery to murder, from sympathetic husband to accused killer. The interviews Kevin had given, his tearful appeals that had garnered so much sympathy, were now rebroadcast with new context, highlighting the fake emotion, the controlled performance, the subtle ways he blamed Rebecca while pretending to search for her. Public reaction was immediate and visceral. People who donated to Kevin's fund felt manipulated and betrayed.
Volunteers who'd spent days searching felt used. The Dallas community reeled from the revelation that the man they had been supporting had murdered his family and hid them in a storage unit while organizing searches. The betrayal cut deep, transforming sympathy into outrage. The Dallas Police Department held a press conference at 9 a.m. on September 8, 2022. Chief Michael Roberts standing before packed media to announce the arrests and confirm the worst fears of a watching public. Yesterday evening, the bodies of Rebecca Morrison, Madison Morrison, and Tyler Morrison were recovered from a storage facility in southeast Dallas. Following a thorough investigation, Kevin Morrison has been arrested and charged with their murders. This is an ongoing investigation, and we cannot comment on specific evidence at this time. The chief's measured words contrasted with the raw emotion visible in his eyes and in the faces of the detectives standing behind him.
Every officer who'd worked the case had been affected by the cruelty of Kevin's crimes, the particular horror of a father murdering his own children. Martinez stood to the chief's left, her expression grim, knowing that while they'd caught Kevin, the damage he'd inflicted was irreversible. The evidence against Kevin was overwhelming from the start. The Patel security footage showing him home when he claimed to be at work, the cell tower data placing him at the storage facility, the forged financial documents proving premeditation, the bodies found in a unit rented under a fake name with cash Kevin had withdrawn from hidden accounts. But Martinez knew that between arrest and conviction lay the complex path of building a prosecutable case that would convince a jury to impose the ultimate penalty. The investigation entered its evidence-gathering phase as forensic teams processed the storage unit, the Morrison home, and Kevin's vehicle. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Chang, began the difficult work of determining exact causes of death and documenting every injury. The district attorney's office, led by Chief Prosecutor David Klein, assembled a team to handle what would clearly be a high-profile capital murder trial. Kevin's arraignment was scheduled for September 12, 2022, giving prosecutors time to organize their case and prepare for the defense's likely arguments. In those intervening days, more evidence of Kevin's guilt emerged. Bank records showed he'd withdrawn $10,000 in cash on September 2nd, money used for the storage unit rental and other expenses related to hiding his crimes. Credit card statements revealed he'd purchased the duct tape, cleaning supplies, and other materials used in the murders during the week before September 3rd. Most damning were Kevin's internet search histories, recovered from his laptop and phone. On August 28th, he'd searched, "How long can bodies be stored before discovery? Climate-controlled storage versus regular storage decomposition," and "untraceable storage rental." On September 1st, his searches included spousal life insurance beneficiary change, trust fund access after death, and how police investigate missing persons. The digital trail painted a picture of a man methodically planning murder, researching every aspect to maximize his chances of success. Rebecca's family held a press conference on September 9th, her mother Margaret Chen barely able to speak through her tears as she described her daughter as a loving mother who'd been trying to protect her assets and her children from a husband who'd deceived them all. Rebecca discovered Kevin's gambling, his debts, his lies, Margaret said, her voice breaking. She was going to leave him, protect Madison and Tyler from his instability. He couldn't face losing control, losing access to her money, so he took everything from us instead. Margaret displayed Rebecca's last text message, sent on September 2nd. "Mom, I'm scared. Kevin found out I talked to a lawyer. He's being too calm. Please pray for us." The text was sent at 10:47 p.m., less than 17 hours before Rebecca's murder. Margaret's voice broke completely as she continued. She knew something was wrong, and I told her to be careful, to document everything, to keep the kids close. I never imagined he'd do this. What kind of man murders his own children?"
The memorial services for Rebecca, Madison, and Tyler were held on September 11th at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Dallas, the sanctuary overflowing with mourners who'd never met the family but felt connected to them through shared grief. Madison's third-grade teacher spoke about her love of reading and her kindness to classmates. Rebecca's former co-worker from the nonprofit where she'd volunteered described her dedication to helping disadvantaged children. Tyler was too young to have left many marks on the world beyond his family's love, but the pastor spoke of potential stolen, of a life ended before it truly began. The 3 white caskets at the front of the church, 1 adult-sized, 2 heartbreakingly small, symbolized the enormous loss Kevin's selfishness had inflicted. The services became a communal mourning not just for 3 specific individuals, but for the vulnerability of families everywhere, for the terrifying reality that danger sometimes came from within, from the person who should have been the protector. Kevin's arraignment on September 12, 2022, drew massive media attention, with news helicopters circling the courthouse and protesters holding signs demanding justice. Kevin entered the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his earlier confidence replaced by a hollow-eyed recognition that his situation was dire. His attorney, Gerald Foster, a veteran public defender, stood beside him as the charges were read. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to the defendant, which had required disclosure but not recusal, presided over the arraignment with stern efficiency. She read the charges clearly. Kevin Marshall Morrison, you are charged with 3 counts of capital murder in the deaths of Rebecca Chen Morrison, Madison Grace Morrison, and Tyler James Morrison. How do you plead? Foster entered a plea of not guilty, the standard response at this stage. The judge set bail at $10 million, a largely symbolic amount given the severity of the charges and the flight risk Kevin represented. Prosecutor David Klein requested remand without bail, citing the brutality of the crimes, the strength of the evidence, and Kevin's demonstrated capacity for deception and planning. The judge agreed, ordering Kevin held without bail pending trial. The prosecution immediately announced they would seek the death penalty, a decision that reflected both the heinous nature of the crimes and the calculated premeditation Kevin had demonstrated. Texas law allowed capital punishment for multiple murders, especially those involving children, and this case met every criterion for the ultimate sanction. The defense faced an impossible task from the outset. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes horrific, the defendant fundamentally unsympathetic. Foster knew his realistic goal wasn't proving innocence, but preventing execution, trying to convince a jury that life imprisonment served justice better than death. His strategy would focus on mental health, on gambling addiction as a mitigating factor, on the lack of prior violence in Kevin's history. The investigation continued, even as legal proceedings began. Detectives working to understand not just what Kevin had done, but why, seeking to construct a complete narrative of motive and execution that would resonate with a jury. They interviewed Kevin's co-workers at Morrison and Associates Accounting, many of whom described him as personable but intensely concerned with image, someone who drove a luxury car and wore expensive clothes even as his secret debts mounted. Several co-workers mentioned Kevin had become increasingly anxious in the months before the murders, taking frequent phone calls from unknown numbers, leaving work early claiming emergencies, seeming distracted and on edge. One colleague, Samantha Torres, told detectives that Kevin had borrowed $5,000 from her in July, claiming a temporary cash flow issue, promising to repay her within weeks. She'd never seen the money again and had been too uncomfortable to press the issue. The gambling establishments where Kevin had lost his money were subpoenaed for records. The pattern they revealed was devastating. Kevin had started with small bets at legitimate casinos in 2020, gradually escalating to high-stakes poker games at illegal clubs. By early 2022, he was losing thousands weekly, sometimes tens of thousands in a single night. Dealers and pit bosses described him as desperate to chase losses, convinced the next hand would recoup everything, exhibiting classic signs of gambling addiction. But what made Kevin's gambling particularly destructive was his absolute refusal to accept limits. When Rebecca put controls on their joint accounts after noticing unexplained withdrawals, Kevin had simply forged her signature to access her trust fund. When that didn't work, he'd borrowed from loan sharks, accumulating debts with interest rates that compounded his crisis. By September 2022, he owed over $240,000 to various creditors, some of whom had begun making threats about consequences if he didn't pay. Investigators theorized that Rebecca's discovery of his debts and her threat to divorce and protect her assets had triggered Kevin's decision to murder. He couldn't let her leave with the trust fund that represented his only hope of escaping his financial hole. He couldn't bear the humiliation of his professional colleagues learning about his gambling problem. And perhaps most significantly, his narcissistic personality couldn't tolerate being seen as a failure, as someone who destroyed his own success through weakness and poor judgment. Dr. Lisa Anderson, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate Kevin for the prosecution, found him to exhibit classic narcissistic personality disorder combined with gambling addiction. Her report described a man with an inflated sense of his own importance, a desperate need for admiration, and a complete inability to empathize with others' pain. Kevin had viewed his family not as people, but as assets or obstacles. Rebecca as a source of money, Madison and Tyler as extensions of himself who would be damaged goods in a divorce, better eliminated than allowed to live with the stain of his failure. Dr. Anderson's evaluation included multiple interviews with Kevin, during which he showed no genuine remorse for his crimes. He expressed regret for being caught, frustration with the investigation, anger at Rebecca for forcing his hand by threatening divorce. But he never spoke about his children with sorrow, never acknowledged the terror they must have felt, never grasped that he'd stolen their entire futures. The psychological evaluation concluded that Kevin posed an extreme danger to others and showed no capacity for rehabilitation, making him an ideal candidate for capital punishment. As fall 2022 turned to winter, the legal proceedings ground forward through discovery, pre-trial motions, and strategic maneuvering by both sides. The prosecution's witness list included over 60 people: neighbors, co-workers, forensic experts, Rebecca's friends and family, the storage unit manager, the security company that provided the Patel footage. Each witness would contribute a piece of the narrative that proved Kevin's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense's witness list was much shorter, focused on mental health experts who would testify about gambling addiction and personality disorders, character witnesses who would describe Kevin's professional success and community involvement before his arrest, and family members who would argue for mercy despite his crimes. But even Foster acknowledged privately that his case was weak, that no amount of mitigation could truly excuse murdering 2 young children. Pre-trial hearings throughout late 2022 and early 2023 addressed numerous motions. The defense sought to suppress Kevin's internet search history, arguing it represented hypothetical research rather than planning, but Judge Morrison ruled it admissible as evidence of premeditation. The defense challenged the admissibility of the forged trust fund documents, claiming insufficient proof Kevin had actually signed them, but handwriting analysis definitively matched his writing. The defense tried to exclude crime scene photos of the children as prejudicial, but the judge ruled their probative value outweighed any prejudicial impact. Each ruling narrowed the defense's options, the evidence against Kevin so comprehensive that traditional reasonable doubt arguments seemed futile. The trial was scheduled for March 2023, giving both sides time to prepare for what would be one of Dallas's most watched criminal proceedings in years.
The case generated intense media coverage, not just locally, but nationally. True crime podcasts and documentary producers seeking interviews with anyone connected to the Morrison family. The story had all the elements that captured public attention. An affluent family destroyed from within, a charming husband revealed as a murderer, innocent children killed by their own father. Kevin's case became a cultural touchstone for discussions about narcissism, gambling addiction, and family violence. Domestic violence advocates used the Morrison murders to educate about financial abuse, pointing out that Kevin's control of finances and his rage at Rebecca's attempt to protect her assets were classic warning signs. They emphasized that the most dangerous time for abuse victims was when they tried to leave, when they threatened the abuser's control. Rebecca had recognized the danger but didn't have enough time to escape it. As March 2023 approached and the trial date neared, the Dallas community remained deeply invested in seeing justice for Rebecca, Madison, and Tyler. The memorial in the park near the Morrison home was still maintained, flowers and stuffed animals refreshed regularly by people who'd never met the victims but mourned them nonetheless. The case represented more than a legal proceeding. It symbolized a community's reckoning with the darkest aspects of human nature, with the devastating consequences of selfishness and violence. Detective Martinez continued working the case even as trial preparation intensified, determined to ensure every piece of evidence was documented, every witness prepared, every potential defense argument anticipated. She'd made a promise to herself standing in that storage unit on September 7th. She would see Kevin Morrison held accountable, would ensure he never had another opportunity to hurt anyone, would make certain that Rebecca, Madison, and Tyler received justice, even though it couldn't bring them back. The trial of Kevin Morrison began on March 13, 2023, in Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom at the Frank Crowley Courts Building in Dallas. The gallery was packed with media representatives, victims' family members, and citizens who'd waited months for this moment. Kevin entered wearing a dark suit his family had provided, his demeanor strangely calm, almost detached, as if he were attending someone else's trial rather than fighting for his life. The jury, selected after 3 weeks of voir dire, consisted of 7 women and 5 men, representing Dallas's diversity. Each had sworn they could consider both conviction and the death penalty if warranted by evidence, though several had expressed discomfort with capital punishment during jury selection. Prosecutor David Klein understood he needed to prove not just guilt, but the extraordinary cruelty that justified execution. Klein rose to deliver the prosecution's opening statement, his movements purposeful as he approached the jury box. On September 3, 2022, Kevin Morrison made a series of choices. Faced with exposure of his gambling debts, faced with his wife's decision to divorce and protect her assets, faced with the collapse of the perfect image he'd constructed, he chose murder. Not impulsive violence in a moment of passion, but calculated, planned annihilation of the 3 people who loved and trusted him most. Klein outlined the case systematically. Kevin's gambling addiction and mounting debts, his forgery of Rebecca's signature on trust fund documents, Rebecca's discovery of his crimes and her plans to leave, the methodical planning revealed in internet searches and supply purchases, the afternoon murders captured circumstantially by security footage and cell tower data, and the disposal of bodies in a storage unit rented under a false name, and the performance of grief Kevin had maintained while knowing exactly where his family lay. Kevin Morrison strangled his wife in their garage. He drowned his 9-year-old daughter in the family pool, holding her underwater while she struggled for 2 full minutes. And he suffocated his 4-year-old son with a pillow, pressing it over
Tyler's face for 4 to 5 minutes while the child fought for air. These weren't quick deaths. They weren't merciful. Kevin Morrison killed his family slowly, intimately, with full consciousness of what he was doing. The defense's opening statement came from Gerald Foster, who faced the impossible task of humanizing a man accused of murdering his children. What Kevin Morrison did was terrible, Unforgivable, Foster acknowledged. His strategy focused on preventing execution rather than proving innocence. But this trial is about more than what happened. It's about understanding how someone with no history of violence, someone who'd been a functioning professional and community member, could commit such acts. Foster outlined Kevin's gambling addiction, describing it as a disease that distorted judgment and created desperate panic. He spoke about financial pressure, about the shame of failure, about mental health issues that had never been properly diagnosed or treated. His argument wasn't that Kevin was innocent, but that he was sick, that execution served no purpose when life imprisonment would adequately protect society while acknowledging his humanity. The prosecution's case began with testimony from Rebecca's best friend, Jennifer Walsh, who described Rebecca's discovery of Kevin's gambling debts, her fear of his reaction, her plans to protect her children and her assets. Jennifer read text messages from Rebecca, her voice breaking as she shared her friend's final words. "He's being too calm. It scares me more than if he'd yelled. I think he's planning something." The jury heard from Margaret and Robert Chen, Rebecca's parents, who described their daughter's love for Madison and Tyler, her devotion as a mother, the panic in her voice when she'd called on September 2nd saying Kevin had found out about her lawyer consultation. Margaret testified that Rebecca had planned to come stay with them the weekend of September 9th, a visit that never happened because Kevin had already decided his family wouldn't leave. Officer Sarah Kim testified about the September 3rd 911 call and the scene that greeted first responders. Kevin's controlled demeanor, his dry eyes, the staged grocery spill that looked too perfect. Detective Martinez took the stand on the third day of trial, walking the jury through the investigation step by step, from initial suspicions through the discovery of the security footage that destroyed Kevin's alibi to the horrifying moment when the storage unit revealed its secrets. The Patel security footage was played for the jury, the courtroom falling silent as they watched Kevin load the rolled carpet and duffel bags into his Mercedes at 4:06 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. on September 3rd. Several jurors glanced at Kevin during the video, their expressions shifting from neutral to troubled. The footage's power was undeniable. This wasn't circumstantial evidence or expert interpretation, but objective reality showing Kevin home when he claimed to be at work, loading items consistent with bodies. Raj Patel testified about his security system and confirmed the timestamp's accuracy. The storage facility manager identified Kevin as the man who'd rented Unit 247 under the name David Chen, paying cash and requesting privacy. Kevin's internet search history was presented through an FBI digital forensics expert, who explained how the searches revealed planning and premeditation, showing Kevin had researched every aspect of murder and disposal. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Chang, provided the trial's most difficult testimony, describing the causes of death for all three victims. Rebecca had died from manual strangulation. The hyoid bone in her throat was fractured by sustained pressure from Kevin's hands. The act would have taken 3 to 4 minutes, during which Rebecca would have been conscious, fighting, aware she was being murdered by her husband. Madison's death by drowning was explained with clinical precision. Water in her lungs, chlorine traces consistent with the family pool. Defensive bruises on her arms where Kevin had held her underwater. Dr. Chang testified that drowning wasn't instantaneous, that Madison would have struggled for approximately 2 minutes before losing consciousness, experiencing terror and pain throughout. The jury heard about Tyler's suffocation, about pillow fibers found in his airways, about the 4 to 5 minutes of sustained pressure required to cause death. The forensic evidence consumed the second week of trial. Blood traces in the Morrison home despite cleaning attempts, Kevin's DNA under Rebecca's fingernails where she'd fought her attacker, carpet fibers linking the Persian rug to Kevin's trunk, Madison's hair clip found in his back seat. Each piece of physical evidence connected Kevin to the crimes, building an irrefutable scientific case alongside the circumstantial timeline. Financial experts testified about Kevin's gambling losses, his forged documents attempting to access Rebecca's trust fund, his mounting debts to increasingly dangerous creditors. The financial motive became crystal clear. Kevin had murdered rather than face public humiliation and financial ruin.
The prosecution rested its case after 11 days of testimony, the weight of evidence so overwhelming that even seasoned legal observers couldn't imagine how the defense could mount an effective response. Kevin had killed his family, hidden their bodies, lied about everything, and the proof was comprehensive and damning. The defense began its case on March 30, 2023, calling Kevin's mother, Dorothy Morrison, to testify about her son's childhood and character. Dorothy, a retired schoolteacher who looked like she'd aged a decade since Kevin's arrest, spoke about her son with a mother's desperate love. She described him as a good student, a helpful child, someone who'd never shown violent tendencies. She spoke about the pressure he put on himself to succeed, to provide for his family, to meet impossible standards. But Klein's cross-examination was devastating. He forced Dorothy to admit that Kevin's younger brother, raised in the same household, had become a well-adjusted adult who'd never harmed anyone. He made her acknowledge that millions of people felt professional pressure without murdering their families. He asked if childhood stress justified strangling your wife, drowning your daughter, suffocating your son, and Dorothy collapsed in tears, unable to answer. Dr. Michael Stevens, a psychiatrist specializing in addiction, testified about gambling disorder, describing it as a recognized mental health condition that could impair judgment and create desperate behaviors. Stevens had evaluated Kevin and diagnosed him with severe gambling disorder, along with narcissistic personality traits. His testimony tried to explain Kevin's crimes as the result of diseased thinking rather than evil character.
But Klein's cross-examination exposed the weakness of this defense. "Dr. Stevens, does gambling disorder cause murder?" he asked pointedly. Stevens had to admit it didn't. Do millions of people struggle with gambling problems without killing anyone? Yes. Did Kevin Morrison's gambling addiction force him to research how to hide bodies? Did it make him forge his wife's signature? Did it drive him to rent a storage unit under a false name? Each question demonstrated that Kevin's crimes required conscious choices, deliberate planning, moral decisions. The defense called colleagues from Morrison and Associates, who described Kevin as a competent professional, someone who'd contributed to the firm, who'd seemed normal until recent months. They testified he'd been a good coworker, had helped train new staff, had participated in community charity events. The defense hoped to show Kevin as a complete person, someone with good qualities alongside his terrible acts. But each character witness admitted under cross-examination that they'd never seen Kevin with his family, never witnessed his interactions with Madison and Tyler, couldn't speak to what kind of husband or father he'd actually been. Their testimony proved only that Kevin could perform normalcy at work, not that he deserved any mercy for murdering his children. On April 5, 2023, against his attorney's vehement advice, Kevin Morrison took the stand in his own defense. He apparently believed his intelligence and charm could sway the jury where evidence had failed. Foster's direct examination was cautious, keeping Kevin focused on his addiction, his shame, his claim that the pressure had become unbearable. Kevin described his gambling as an escape from stress, something that spiraled out of control despite his best intentions. He spoke about the panic when Rebecca discovered his debts, the terror of losing everything he'd worked for. He claimed the murders happened in a dissociative state, that he barely remembered the actual acts, that he was a different person when overcome by desperation. His performance was measured, his answers carefully crafted, his demeanor calculated to appear remorseful without actually admitting clear guilt. David Klein's cross-examination was a masterclass in prosecution technique, systematically destroying every lie and exposing Kevin's true nature. "Mr. Morrison, you claim you were in a dissociative state during the murders, but you remember researching storage facilities beforehand?" Kevin stumbled. "You say you don't recall killing your family, but you remember exactly how to get to the storage unit?" Kevin's face flushed. Klein continued relentlessly. "You testified you loved your children, but you told Jennifer Walsh that Madison was Rebecca's problem, didn't you?" Kevin tried to deny it, but the text message was displayed.
When you held Madison underwater in the pool for 2 minutes, when she was struggling and fighting, were you dissociated then? Kevin's composure began cracking. When you pressed the pillow over Tyler's face while he fought for air for 4 or 5 minutes, was that automatic, unconscious? Klein forced Kevin to explain every calculated choice, why he'd forged Rebecca's signature if he was so overcome with emotion, why he'd paid cash for the storage unit if he wasn't thinking clearly, why he'd performed for news cameras if he was genuinely distraught. Each question revealed Kevin's consciousness of his actions, his deliberate attempts to avoid detection, his complete lack of genuine remorse. The moment that destroyed Kevin when Klein asked simply, "Why did you kill Tyler?" Kevin's mask finally slipped completely. He would have gone with Rebecca, Kevin snapped, his voice hard. I wasn't going to lose my kids to her. If I couldn't have them as part of my perfect family, then no one could have them. The courtroom erupted. Margaret Chen screamed. Foster looked stricken at his client's self-destruction. In one unguarded moment of narcissistic rage, Kevin had admitted the truth. He'd killed his children not in dissociation or desperation, but in cold calculation, to deny Rebecca the one thing that mattered more than anything. He'd murdered Madison and Tyler rather than allow them to live as products of his failed marriage, of his exposed weakness. The defense rested the next morning, Foster knowing any attempt to rehabilitate Kevin after his confession would only make things worse. Closing arguments began on April 7, 2023, Klein delivering a systematic summary that left no doubt about Kevin's guilt or the appropriateness of death as punishment. Kevin Morrison gambled away his family's money, forged his wife's name to steal from her trust fund, and when she discovered his crimes and chose to leave, he murdered all 3 of them. He researched how to hide bodies. He bought supplies. He waited until he was alone with them. He killed each one deliberately: strangulation, drowning, suffocation. Methods that required sustained action, conscious choice. And then he hid them in a storage unit and pretended to search for them. Klein paused for effect. Capital murder isn't just about killing multiple people. It's about the kind of killing that society deems so heinous, so beyond redemption, that death is the only adequate response. Kevin Morrison drowned his 9-year-old daughter. He suffocated his 4-year-old son. These weren't accidents. They weren't moments of lost control. They were choices, repeated over and over during the minutes it took those children to die. If this case doesn't warrant the death penalty, then the death penalty has no purpose. The defense's closing argument was a lawyer's professional duty rather than a winnable argument. He asked the jury to consider life imprisonment as sufficient, to recognize that executing Kevin wouldn't bring back his victims, to show mercy even where mercy seemed impossible to find. But his own words rang hollow against the horror of Kevin's crimes and the confession he'd made on the witness stand. The jury received the case on April 8, 2023, Judge Morrison providing detailed instructions on the elements of capital murder and the criteria for imposing death. The jurors filed out to begin deliberations, and the courtroom settled into anxious waiting. The verdict came faster than many expected. After just 14 hours spread across 2 days, the jury returned on April 9th with their decision. The courtroom was packed as Judge Morrison asked the jury foreman, a software engineer named Patricia Williams, if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor," Williams answered clearly. The tension was electric as the bailiff carried the verdict forms to the judge, who reviewed them briefly before instructing Williams to read the verdicts aloud. In the matter of the state of Texas versus Kevin Marphil Morrison on the charge of capital murder in the death of Rebecca Chen Morrison, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Margaret Chen sobbed openly. On the charge of capital murder in the death of Madison Grace Morrison, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Robert Chen gripped his wife's hand. On the charge of capital murder in the death of Tyler James Morrison, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Kevin showed no visible reaction, his face a mask as the three guilty verdicts sealed his fate. The trial immediately moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would determine whether Kevin should receive death or life imprisonment. Under Texas law, they needed to answer three questions: whether Kevin deliberately caused the deaths, whether he posed a continuing threat to society, and whether sufficient mitigating circumstances existed to warrant life rather than death. The penalty phase began with victim impact statements that captured the human cost of Kevin's crimes. Margaret Chen spoke about the emptiness of her home, without Madison's laughter, without Tyler's hugs, without Rebecca's phone calls. She described missing first days of school, birthday parties, graduations that would never happen. Kevin didn't just kill 3 people. He killed every moment they would have lived, every experience they would have had, every bit of joy they would have brought to this world, she said, her voice breaking. Rebecca's brother Andrew Chen spoke about his sister's kindness, her intelligence, her fierce love for her children. He read Rebecca's final text message again, the one where she'd said she was scared, and his voice shook with rage and grief. She knew. She told us something was wrong, and we couldn't save her. Kevin took that chance away from us when he murdered our family. The prosecution presented evidence of Kevin's behavior since arrest: his complete lack of remorse, his attempts to manipulate jail staff, his continued narcissistic focus on his own grievances rather than his victims' suffering. Jail officers testified that Kevin had complained about food quality, about his cell accommodations, about media coverage, but had never once expressed genuine sorrow for what he'd done. One guard recounted Kevin saying, "If Rebecca had just been reasonable about the money, none of this would have happened. She forced me into an impossible situation." The statement, made casually while requesting extra reading material, demonstrated Kevin's continued refusal to accept responsibility, his persistent belief that he was the victim of circumstances rather than a man who'd chosen to murder his family. Dr. Lisa Anderson returned to testify about Kevin's psychological evaluation, explaining that his narcissistic personality disorder and lack of empathy made him fundamentally dangerous. Kevin Morrison will always blame others for his problems. He will always view people as objects to be used or eliminated. He poses an extreme risk to
anyone who challenges his self-image or threatens his interests. There is no treatment that will change this core aspect of his personality. The defense's penalty phase case was brief and weak. Dr. Stevens returned to testify about gambling addiction and mental health, arguing that Kevin's conditions warranted treatment rather than execution. Dorothy Morrison spoke again, pleading for her son's life, despite acknowledging the horror of his crimes. Character witnesses described Kevin's professional accomplishments, his intelligence, his potential to do something meaningful even in prison. But Klein's rebuttal was devastating. He asked each witness whether Kevin's good qualities justified drowning Madison, suffocating Tyler, strangling Rebecca. He forced them to acknowledge that intelligence without empathy made Kevin more dangerous, not less. He argued that Kevin's education and professional success proved he'd had every advantage, every opportunity to choose differently, making his crimes even more inexcusable. Closing arguments in the penalty phase took place on April 13, 2023. Klein's summation was powerful and personal, asking the jury to remember the 2 minutes Madison struggled underwater, the 4 minutes Tyler fought for air, the moments of terror and betrayal as Kevin murdered the people who loved him most. Kevin Morrison deserves death because he chose death for 3 innocent people, Klein concluded. Justice demands that he face the same finality he imposed on his family. Foster's final argument asked for mercy, for life imprisonment as adequate punishment, for recognition that execution was vengeance rather than justice. But his words couldn't overcome the jury's memory of Kevin's courtroom confession, his admission that he'd killed his children rather than allow them to live with Rebecca,
his complete absence of remorse or humanity. The jury deliberated on the special issues for 9 hours, returning on April 14, 2023, with answers that condemned Kevin to death. To the question of deliberate killing, yes, unanimously. To the question of future dangerousness, yes, unanimously. To the question of sufficient mitigation, no, 11-1. One juror had been moved by the addiction testimony, but the others found no reason to spare Kevin's life. Judge Morrison scheduled formal sentencing for April 20, 2023, giving all parties time to prepare for the trial's final chapter. In the intervening days, news coverage analyzed every aspect of the case, debating whether justice had been served, whether the death penalty was appropriate, whether cases like Kevin's justified capital punishment's continued existence. Public opinion in Texas strongly supported the death sentence, with polls showing 92% approval for executing someone who'd murdered his own children after drowning one and suffocating the other. The formal sentencing hearing on April 20, 2023 was brief but significant. Judge Morrison asked if Kevin wished to make a statement, and, against all advice, he chose to speak. He began with words that sounded like prepared remorse, but quickly devolved into self-justification. "Rebecca should have understood my situation," he said, his narcissism overwhelming any strategic sense. "She should have helped me instead of threatening to leave. If she'd just been reasonable, we'd all still be together." Judge Morrison cut him off. "Mr. Morrison, your complete inability to accept responsibility, even now, confirms this jury's wisdom in recommending death. You murdered your wife and children to protect your pride and your access to money. You are the most dangerous kind of criminal, one who believes he's the victim." She formally imposed the death sentence, ordering Kevin remanded to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for execution by lethal injection. As Kevin was led from the courtroom, Margaret Chen called out, "I hope you see their faces every day. I hope Madison's struggle haunts you. I hope Tyler's last breaths never leave your mind. I hope you suffer every day until they execute you." Kevin showed no reaction, but those watching believed Margaret's curse was just, that Kevin deserved to be tormented by memories of what he'd done. The appeals process began automatically, Kevin's attorneys filing notices challenging various aspects of the trial. But legal experts predicted all arguments would fail. The evidence was overwhelming, the trial had been conducted properly, and Kevin's own courtroom confession had eliminated any reasonable doubt about his guilt or intent. Kevin was transferred to death row at the Polunsky unit, where he would spend the rest of his life, whether 5 years or 30, in solitary confinement. For a narcissist who craved attention and admiration, the isolation would be its own punishment. He would have decades to contemplate his choices, to face the reality that his gambling, his forgery, his murders had all led to this cage. Rebecca's family established the Morrison Foundation, supporting gambling addiction treatment, financial literacy education, and domestic violence prevention. They channeled their grief into helping others avoid similar tragedies, ensuring their loved ones' deaths might prevent future losses. The Dallas community erected a memorial in the park where Madison had played, where Tyler had learned to swing, where Rebecca had spent countless hours as a devoted mother. The case changed Dallas's consciousness about financial abuse, about the warning signs of family violence, and about the danger that narcissistic personalities pose when challenged. Domestic violence organizations reported increased awareness and more people seeking help to safely leave controlling partners. The Morrison murders became a teaching case, analyzed in criminal justice courses, studied in psychology programs, and used to educate about the intersection of narcissism, addiction, and violence. As years passed and Kevin's appeals wound through the courts, the certainty remained that he would die in prison, whether by injection or natural causes.
He would never again hurt innocent people, never again destroy lives in service of his pride and selfishness. His children, whose murders had earned him this fate, would never be forgotten. Their names spoken at memorial services, their photos cherished by family, and their loss mourned by a community that had never known them but grieved for them nonetheless.
Justice had been served through conviction, condemnation, and the promise that Kevin Morrison would pay with his life for the 3 innocent lives he'd stolen. It wasn't restoration, wasn't healing, wasn't enough to fill the void left by Rebecca, Madison, and Tyler. But it was justice. Imperfect, painful, necessary justice in a world where senseless tragedy strikes, and society must respond with all the tools it possesses to hold the guilty accountable and protect the innocent from similar fates.